The Madlanga Commission is showing up what has been alleged for a while, that there is a shadow state in South Africa. A bunch of criminals that are extracting money from sometimes the most vulnerable people in our society, not least of which are the people that need quality health care. Today we are joined by journalist and author of The Shadow State, Jeff Wicks, who explains to us exactly how these syndicates work. They work with the complicity of our politicians to take money away from people who need it at their most desperate times. Before we get into the interview with Jeff, I want to remind you that this episode is sponsored by Pace Car Rental. When you need to hire a car, go to their website, use the code SONA and get a discount. And remember, subscribe to The State of the Nation so that we can keep bringing you great interviews like this. So now let's hear from the man himself, Jeff Wicks. Jeff Wicks, welcome to The State of the Nation.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike. It's an important story to talk about.
Yeah, and it's an important book. The timing is spectacular because it coincides with what we're hearing at the Madlanga Commission and various ad hoc parliamentary things. It's a story that's kind of been bubbling under forever since we heard about skinny jeans and PPE scandals and so on. You know, we knew that healthcare was, or stealing money from hospitals was kind of the new gold in South Africa. Most countries, they steal money. Yeah, we steal from hospitals. It's pretty sick, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it takes a special kind of psychopath to steal from a hospital in general, but then even more pertinently, a government hospital, a facility that, when you consider Tembisa, perennially overcrowded, understaffed and under-resourced, and now it had 2 billion rand pulled out of its coffers with very little in return for that. And the only ones who really suffer at the end of the day are the patients, the ones who are subjected to a facility that's falling apart and sometimes set ablaze by arsonists. So I think that's the true damage of these extraction networks, and yes, it's quite pertinent for what's going on at the Madlanga Commission and also the recent revelations from the SIU, because a lot of the dramatic personnel we mention in the book also feature at the Commission and in the SIU's report.
Yeah, and in that way you foreran the Commission because so much of it is emerging with those networks, and what will emerge soon enough is the political killings and various other crime like drug syndicates, etc., assassinations. Now, the book is The Shadow State and Why Babita Deokaran Had to Die, which is a must read. I mean, I really, we were talking about it before we started. We've had many books that were written about corruption in South Africa, but never one that has been so well written and so well personalized to take in this tragedy of a woman trying to do a job. And because she was trying to do a job, she had to go. Tell us a bit about why Babita had to go.
Well, I think Babita threatened the shadow state, and the shadow state is really a device to describe an evolution of state capture, which we're seeing. And, the visceral example is Tembisa Hospital. She filed a report into suspicious payments and put a freeze on others. And I think with that report, she threatened to bring the entire house down. And within 19 days of filing that report, she was dead. And, when we think about how that hospital was captured, it's actually ingenious. They targeted low-value contracts, and low-value contracts attract low scrutiny. When we have multi-billion rand SOE tenders, there's a lot of attention there. But with the opaque nature of our state and the way they closely guard the way they spend taxpayer money, these were 500,000 rand payments just executed at scale. And I mean, it's devastating to think how much money was pulled out of that hospital in just 2 years. It's an obscene amount of cash, and even more obscene is what we found when we followed that money and saw what it was spent on instead of being spent on the patients at Tembisa Hospital.
Yeah, because, I mean, even though you've subtitled this Why Babita Deokaran Had to Die, you could subtitle that and say, God knows how many other thousands of people had to die or suffer because they couldn't get healthcare at our healthcare facilities while the money was being spent on mansions in Bantry Bay and Hyde Park, etc.
Absolutely right. I mean, just look at the example of Shonisani Letole, the man who was basically starved to death at Tembisa Hospital during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And many can say, well, that's an act of God. It's COVID and he died. But he was so badly mistreated. And again, that mistreatment can be traced back to corruption. The reason why that hospital was so short-staffed was because they didn't have any PPE. Yet PPE was flooding in via donations, and the Gauteng Health Department was spending billions, in fact, on PPE, yet there still wasn't enough. So there were no hospital staff to treat him, and that's why he was essentially starved for over 124 hours and succumbed. He's not the only one. There will be many an example of people who've died at Tembisa Hospital with the root cause of that death being corruption there.
Yeah. And one mustn't forget that the president stood up at the start of the COVID pandemic saying that no money will be misspent and there will be repercussions if anybody does it. There were people in his very office, Kuselo Diko and other people, that were stealing money under his nose, and he still hasn't done anything about it. So that's a separate issue. I think let's go to the book. Let's talk about the gripping way you sort of take us into the book, which is the murder. It's the murder of Babita. Those terrible last moments that she had to endure.
Yeah, and I think the point of writing it as I did, emotively and dramatically, because that's exactly what it was. It was a killing with ruthless intent, and it's also part of the reason why we got onto this story to begin with, and also by dint of her position as chief accountant at Gauteng Health, but also this was a clear-cut hit. And unfortunately, in the South African context, we've seen more and more of these targeted assassinations where officials or anyone who really becomes a bulwark against corruption falls into the crosshairs of assassins. And that should tell us that there's a crossover between state procurement and the criminal underworld, that people will take steps to protect illicit revenue streams. And Babita's story is important in many ways. And, I wanted the book to be a tribute to her sacrifice and her ethical stance, because we need more civil servants who actually want to serve. The case study of Tembisa tells us that Babita was essentially an island in the sea of corruption, because for this extraction scheme to work, and to work as devastatingly effectively as it did, they needed the entire value chain, and Babita was alone in trying to stand against that.
Yeah, she was really, really undermined by her boss, who comes out as this Lerato Maduya, who seemed to try and stop everything that Babita was doing to unearth this corruption and sort of just bypass her.
Yeah, well, Lerato Maduya is a proven liar, and we can say that because we got Babita's WhatsApp messages where not only did she file the report, but then she went back and she sent that famous message, which is imprinted on the back of the book, saying, the Tembisa guys might be onto us if their money is not released and our lives might be in danger. Maduya's response was to say, don't worry, I've asked the HOD for approval for an investigation. That was a complete bald lie. The first time the HOD heard about Babita's concerns was on the day of her murder. The 100 million rand that Babita had frozen was quietly released, and there was never a forensic investigation. That report, which basically set this book in motion, was suppressed and buried for months before we found it.
Yeah. To the point that Babita at one point was even suspended from her position without pay.
Yes, I mean, and I think it's sort of a testament to the person that she was, because she stayed in that job. She fought to get her job back, and she was disciplined on trumped-up charges related to the PPE scandal, which touched the president's office, because she refused to sign those deals. So she was summarily suspended and moved out of her office. And once all the rogues were rinsed out of the system after an SIU investigation, she returned to her office. And the Tembisa Hospital probe was her final investigation. So she's been a victim of a corrupt system on many occasions. And in the last instance, it cost her life.
Yeah, take us through those last minutes of her life.
So it's something that I've labored on for years doing this investigation. And we know from the details held on her cell phone that she left home just before 7 o'clock in the morning, dropped her daughter at school, went to Checkers to pick up some groceries. And all that time, she was actually being followed by the Izinkabi, the hitmen who'd been stalking her for days. And as she pulled up to her driveway gate, the white BMW pulled up alongside her, and gunmen just peppered the side of her car with a salvo of bullets, and she was shot 12 times. She died later in hospital. Thankfully for her family, some of them made it there in time to at least be able to say goodbye. Among them was her teenage daughter, Tiara.
And I mean, these shooters, it wasn't like they were on top of the building across the road. They literally walked up to her vehicle. They were within touching distance of her.
Yes, it was up close and personal. I mean, we got our hands on the autopsy report, and the pathologist detailed stippling on her skin, and we know that stippling means close range attacks. So in some instances, the guns were basically pressed up against her skin, and that tells us there was a real intent behind her murder. Someone needed to make sure she was dead, and that report, which was essentially the 10-page document that got her killed, is an explanation for that ruthlessness.
Incredible. And then what starts is either Keystone Cops, modern version of really bad policing, or a willful effort to not have this case investigated. People didn't gather the evidence. They didn't secure the crime scene. No real investigation until almost by chance some normal policemen do some basic investigation and basically almost crack the case within days.
I think just looking at the Babita Deokaran murder as an example, it tells us about the issues we have in law enforcement. And contrasted against her murder is the fact that the police will only solve 1 in 10 murders in this country. So if you kill someone, you've got a 90% chance of getting away scot-free. So that explains why things like the initial handling of the crime scene was botched. Then we have the involvement of a good policeman, a veteran cop who came in and through using his own intelligence structures was able to secure the arrest of the hitmen. They've eventually been convicted. But we saw the entire case fall apart when the Hawks took over. We've been able to prove that they seized Babita's cell phone and laptop on the day of her murder. And remember, those devices became the lodestar for our investigation. Everything we found was on those devices, which they had. 7 months later, they returned them to the family, and then we got our hands on them. And we could tell that they'd never been forensically examined. The police will deny this, but what's fatal for them is after we wrote a series of stories setting out the basis of what we had, which was the laptop and the cell phone, they had to go back to the family, tail between their legs, and ask for those devices back. So, that is valuable digital forensic evidence, which, and I'm not a policeman, but just logic dictates that you'd look at it, because I found that document after getting access to her laptop within 10 minutes. And I'm sorry, it's a viable motive for murder. 850 million rand in dubious payments, which we now know is 2 billion rand, is a complete viable motive for murder, and that was never examined by the Hawks. Beyond that, one of the men arrested in the days after the killing was inexplicably released. His cell phones and his cash that he carried with him was handed back. The cell phones were never examined. And we only find out 3 years later, when the hitmen are sentenced, that the man that they released was the one who actually pulled the trigger. So the Hawks had the shooter in custody. And if they'd properly followed those leads, done the investigative work that they are mandated to do, we might have seen a completely different outcome in this case. And the Deokaran family may not have been denied justice as they have been.
Yeah, and to the point where there was the policeman who had done such a great job, had even isolated where the vehicle was with the guns inside it at some flats in Kempton Park and allowed it to get away.
It beggars belief, and it's a rare opportunity where you get to peek behind the veil at how a police investigation works, or how a police investigation completely falls apart. And that's what we've seen here. And obviously, it's an endemic issue. It's root causes about problems within our police force. And maybe that's the benefit of the Madlanga Commission now, because I think since the Zondo Commission, and even prior to that, we've required urgent reforms in the way that our police are structured, and also addressing issues of how corrupt and criminal elements manage to infiltrate and sway the management ranks. If we see that at the end of this Madlanga Commission, then it's going to be beneficial. But what remains is that we must see change. The status quo cannot continue as it is. 1 in 10 murders solved. That beggars belief, and it's disgusting, frankly. The detection rate for other crimes will be lower. And it's now become clear that the police are completely incapable of delivering on their constitutional mandate. And the people who suffer are South African citizens. If you look at just the happenings in the first stanzas of this commission, you've got the entire crime intelligence management suite out on bail and suspended from their jobs. You've got the top echelons of police management not focused on the business of the day, which is fighting crime, they're busy fighting each other at the commission. And this has ended up being a spy versus spy game. And my view is that there are no angels in this. We need to ask serious questions of everyone who goes there, because the responsibility they bear is so great and they haven't been able to deliver.
Yeah, one wonders if the suspension mechanism isn't half of the problem, because people get suspended rather than fired or charged or whatever needs to happen. It just seems to be one way you can kick the can down the road, and eventually the news cycle moves on. But the big sort of story is the shadow state behind all of this. And that gets unearthed in the book, and it's coming out, as we say, at the Madlanga Commission. Tell us about that shadow state. What does it look like? Who are the key players? How did it get to this?
So the shadow state has come to be, in my view, because of the void left by policing. And when we talk about the shadow state, we must frame them as organized crime syndicates. Tender fraud and procurement fraud is no longer a white-collar crime. It's high-tech, it's well-orchestrated, and it also has ties to the criminal underworld. So this is syndicate activity and criminal syndicate activity. And what the shadow state is, really, is the diversion of tax money. Imagine the state of Tembisa Hospital if it had that 2 billion rand back. What that facility would look like, and what that facility would look like for its patients. And instead, the shadow state sees this cash diverted away from its intended destination into the pockets of a wealthy few. And then that spawns a whole illicit economy, because now you have dirty money and you still want to buy your supercars and your mansions. So you must go to the real estate agents and the car dealerships who are less than scrupulous. And you go to lawyers who will help you cover your tracks and accountants that will help you hide your money. These are all the enablers that allow the shadow state to be, and it thrives. I'm very confident that what we're seeing in Tembisa Hospital is being replicated elsewhere. We know of at least 5 other facilities in Gauteng alone. I'm confident that there's other hospitals nationally who have faced these same syndicates, and let's see if they've capitulated. But this is something that goes on every day. And the way they target small payments at an industrial scale means it often goes unseen until it's too late, until they get to the point where they're so greedy that someone like a Babita Deokaran simply cannot look away because the red flags are so glaring.
Yeah, so the way it kind of gets in is the syndicate knows somebody, knows that a tender's coming out, gives a tender, or gives, in some cases, a couple of tenders. You even mentioned one of the guys, Raju, who's got 60 companies. They're all tendering, so you might put in a whole bunch of tenders for the same particular tender. Somebody on the inside. They give you they award the tender to you at an inflated cost, and then you go for your badge after that. Is that roughly the way it works?
So the way it worked, and the key thing here is that they targeted the RFQ system. So procurement at that stage, beneath 500,000 rand, could be done within the hospital. The SCM office would obviously have to identify the need, and then they would pick 3 companies to get quotes from. But the outcome was engineered in the sense that these supply chain management officials had been bought. So you get an RFQ for bandages, and you go to the same syndicate companies, which are, thinly veiled but controlled by the same man. and two of them inflate their prices. The other one comes in just under 5,000 Rand, and that's where you go. So the outcome is engineered, and value for money is completely taken off the table. And we could see from looking at the payment records that these different syndicates would have their own SCM days where their orders would be processed. So in essence, these syndicates would make several million Rand in a single day because the entire system had been captured from start to finish.
And then it just becomes a machine. It just becomes something you're sending out literally dozens, if not more, tenders every day, and you're getting half of them, and you're just processing them, and you give that wonderful case of the buckets. These are buckets one goes and buys for $100 at a supermarket, going at 10,000 Rand a bucket.
Yeah, 2 in red, 2 in blue, a 40,000 Rand spend out of Tembisa Hospital.
You never mentioned they were the rare red and blue buckets.
That's my folly.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, we've picked up overpricing pretty much in every purchase order we looked at. And the way to understand that is that the pricing didn't matter. Because you had the procurement chain captured. So no one was going to have any qualms about, well, this is too expensive, or we've got a benchmark for this product. It was just simply rubber stamped. And when you look at the quantities and some of the things that they were buying, it makes you understand that all of this was actually completely contrived. A good example is the pediatric blood pressure cuffs. Now, those are not single-use items. They can be used for months if they're cared for properly. Tembisa Hospital bought 1,200 individual units. The hospital only has a bed capacity, which is mostly occupied by adults, of 840. So the amounts and the quantities of these things were all contrived just to get it to reach beneath that 500,000 Rand threshold. And we saw some coming really close, 499,998 Rand. That was the level of greed because their extraction became so easy. They didn't care about being noticed anymore. And they didn't count on Babita Deokaran, basically.
Yeah, and for this to emerge, but there was a whole lot of these kind of things, and various syndicates, as we've grown to understand, being run by pretty high-profile crooks here. We know Kat Matlala, but it's not only him. There's the president's nephew, Hangwani Maumela, Rudolph Mazibuko. There's a number of them. Tell me, do they all operate the same, and they all sort of operate within the same circle, don't they?
Absolutely. They all have found a home at Tembisa Hospital's procurement section, and those were the 3 syndicates that we'd identified in our investigation, which has now been confirmed by the SIU. Maumelo, of course, seems to be the biggest player, a network of 41 companies, not all helmed by him, but what the SIU have been able to connect to him as his network, responsible for 820 million Rand. Then Govind Raju with approximately 60 companies, that's 600 million Rand. Mazibuko, he was somewhat rudimentary in the way that he structured his extraction syndicate because all of the companies were in his name, either his name, his wife, his son, or his brother. But they all operated on the same premise and with the same method. And that's how they were able to get so rich so quickly from Tembisa Hospital.
Yeah. And where does the money end up?
Well, I mean, if we just focus on Morgan Maumela, he's a prolific spender and a man with a real taste for the finer things in life. I mean, we tracked 330 million Rand procurement of property through his family trust in the space of 5 years. And those 5 years really do coincide with his success at Tembisa Hospital. We know the SIU has placed the value of his assets at nearly 500 million Rand. Of that, more than 200 million Rand is on supercars. So these are the trappings of wealth that really just underscore the excess of this whole thing. And I mention it in the book. One of Hangwani's villas in Hyde Park was actually featured on Top Billing. A show that really turns my stomach because I have a resentment towards wealth and excess. And this was a bespoke home which had been decorated with curated art and personally produced furniture. No expense was spared, and it really hits home for you when you can contrast that against what Tembisa Hospital looks like, because Tembisa Hospital paid for that. So that's where the money intended for the patients went. It went into a single man's pocket. It made him eye-wateringly wealthy.
It is time to reset South Africa. Join me with my special guests, Prince Mashele, Frans Cronje, Mandisa Mashego, Davy Ruat, Bonsai Shongwe, Wayne Divenage, for this not-to-be-missed one-day summit on the 13th of November 2025 in Sandton. Join us as we discuss what it will take to reset South Africa. So visit sona.co.za and be part of the solution. Now back to the show. Yeah, and we must remember that while this is happening, the state can't afford to hire doctors. We've seen a whole lot of recently qualified doctors. They can't get positions because the state doesn't have money to pay those doctors while they're paying 10,000 Rand for a red or a blue bucket. So these things have real-world consequences. I think perhaps you're being a bit harsh on top billing. It's replaced police file as a way for us to catch our criminals. But those syndicates, it's not just about tender rigging or, this procurement. There's also other legs to it, which includes, if need be, the use of violence. They all have their muscle arm, and most of them were sort of quite friendly with Kat Matlala, who ran the muscle arm. So if somebody got in the way, like Babita, you could do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd stop short of drawing that link, but I consider Kat Matlala to be really a prominent player in the Maumela syndicate, and the two were obviously close. I mean, Kat was seen as Morgan's muscle and as his consigliere who would solve his problems for him, and Kat Matlala is a violent and dangerous man if the state's case against him proves true, because now he's before court facing charges relating to 3 attempted assassinations. So that'll give you a sense of his character, obviously. Allegedly, but that's the crossover. That's the crossover between a traditional white-collar crime of tender procurement, and then we will defend our crimes if necessary, defend these illicit revenue streams.
Tell me about the role of politicians in all of this, because obviously this gets political sanction. When you start seeing this, and obviously Tembisa Hospital has been the scene of a crime for the last 5 years that we know of, obviously goes back. Before then, you've uncovered stuff that goes back, I think, as far as 2017, 18. So it obviously probably predates that. But if it's happening in Gauteng, it's happening in all the hospitals, probably not just one. And in order to do this, you need political cover. Who were some of the key role players in the Gauteng government at that time, MEC for Health, etc., people that could see this overspending and did nothing about it?
So this scandal obviously traverses the careers of 2 health MECs. The first was Dr. Bandile Masuku, who got his marching orders for separate corruption scandal. And then he was replaced by Dr. Mogeti. And, those individuals were at the political tiller of these departments. And I mean, the majority of our work was done under Mogeti's tenure. And she really made a significant effort to try and whitewash this thing. She refused to even acknowledge that Babita's report existed, and she refused to acknowledge her as a whistleblower because she never apparently formally reported this deal. Then again, on the side of those who benefited, we've got a sitting ANC office bearer, Selo Sokoko, who through 3 companies has made many millions of rands through inflated contracts, which we were able to prove.
And when you say sitting, we're talking about
current office bearer.
Still an office bearer.
The taint of the story has not dampened his political career, as we see often. Then you've got the hospital manager, who's very closely aligned with the PBF, the Professional Business Forum, which is, as we know, an arm of the ANC. And then if we look at the architecture of the health department, all of those top managers are ANC deployees under an ANC political head. And then it makes you understand that Tembisa Hospital was able to blow its budget for more than 3 years, and not only blow its budget by a small margin, literally quadruple blow its budget. And this was allowed to continue. Those are political machinations and political missteps that we see that have allowed this to happen, because in a just and sane world, if you run your business and you blow your budget, there will be consequences for you. You'll feel it immediately. But we're dealing with bottomless state coffers. So whereas Tembisa Hospital's goods and services budget was 200 million Rand, they went ahead and spent 800 million Rand. Where were the consequences for that? That was allowed to continue for years, and that's a political problem beyond anything else.
Yeah, and while this was happening, one must remember that the Charlotte Maxeke General Hospital was half closed because of a fire that had happened before, where there was tender issues around the repair of that hospital as well. So once again, I mean, we want to keep on sort of linking this to real world consequences.
Yeah. I mean, that's the cause and effect. It really is. We cannot consider corruption as being victimless, because the people who suffer are the ones who fail to get services. And in this case, the service is not a road or water. It is desperately needed medical care that people will seek out in the lowest ebb of their lives. And then they are hard done by. And the hospitals in our province are falling apart, and it makes you wonder to what extent these syndicates have begun to cripple the entire system, and what impact that 2 billion rand extraction, which is not a value for money payment, they got very little, if anything at all, in return, how this will cripple the health department going forward. And, again, we need urgent reforms in the way this department runs. It has a 67 billion rand per annum budget. That's a big trough to feed at.
Yeah, and there's little wonder that there's so much appetite for a national health insurance where you put every bit of healthcare under the same budget, run by the same people that we are talking about. So we can see why the government is so keen on the national health insurance, because that gives them control of every single hospital, not just Tembisa or a few other Gauteng hospitals. It's every single hospital, clinic, etc. in the country that will be buying 10,000 rand buckets. The beggars, we must just remember that. Now, let's talk about the sort of political heads, the Gauteng premiers. Because I think what people don't understand is there's very little that the provincial government is responsible for, other than schools, some roads, and hospitals, healthcare in each province. So, there's not a lot of work that the Premier has to do but that. And, David Makura, I think, was the Premier at the time, replaced by Panyaza Lesufi. Did any of them come to the party at any point?
I think the only way they came to the party was via some convenient lip service to service their own political ends. To Makura's credit, he at least went to the SIU and asked them to come in and investigate this on a secondment agreement. But that shouldn't be seen as noble. That was after several months of being bashed by us and the press. So I think that was something of an escape route for him. And then we've got our sitting premier, the bombastic Panyaza Lesufi, who will come and claim credit for all of this. But what Premier Lesufi must remember is that when the hospital manager and Babita's direct boss, Lerato Maggio, were suspended and then disciplined based on 13 charges of misconduct out of this Tembisa Hospital scandal, it was the Premier's office who was running that disciplinary hearing. That disciplinary hearing dragged on for 2 years, to the point that Mtunzi, the hospital manager, died, and Lerato Maggio was allowed to resign with no censure or sanction. So you cannot say that you're taking a strong stance against corruption when your track record tells us a completely different story.
Yeah. Now, there's a common theme there with whistleblowing, and that is that the whistleblower gets turned on. The whistleblower gets accused of the very corruption that they're blowing the whistle on. That seems to be stamped all over this particular expose, right? Is that whatever the whistleblower has brought to the attention of, that person gets suspended to being involved in one way or another. We've even seen that in the Madlanga Commission, where there's been certainly people that come out of left field suddenly saying the people saying that there's problems in the police are the problem themselves.
I think whistleblowing was an important trope, because I don't think Babita set out to be a whistleblower. I think she was just trying to do a job, but in death she's been something of an icon for whistleblowing and good civil servantry. It's something that we see a lot in the course of our work, where whistleblowers are pariahed and they run out of the system and face destitution if they're not killed. But the difficulty about whistleblowers is now that the nefarious actors in our society have realized that if you robe yourself as a whistleblower, you get inordinate amounts of public support and some modicum of protection. And that's what we have to guard against as journalists. We have to test that whistleblower mantle really carefully, because it's very easy for a fox to slip into the henhouse. Again, what the book highlights, and it should highlight, is that whistleblowers are not protected by legislation or otherwise. And if we are going to turn the tide of corruption, whistleblowers play a pivotal role in that, and they must be protected. I mean, the former Chief Justice Ondo himself said it. If we don't protect the whistleblowers, they won't be there the next time we need them. Babita is a case in point in that respect.
Now, you do quite a lot of investigative journalism. You've just recently come out with a story that links very much the same syndicates to hospitals in the Northwest. We're talking about potentially R1 billion being with the same MO, the same modus operandi. And there's no reason why it shouldn't happen in these adjacent provinces. This isn't sort of area specific. It seems to be obviously a replicatable way of extracting money. Is that what you're finding?
Yes, absolutely. I think they've got the system down. And if you can purchase the people on the inside, then it becomes incredibly easy. And I think it's an obvious move when the heat was turned up at Tembisa to look at other revenue streams. And I think the underlying issue here is that all of the 217 companies that Babita flagged, and the SIU is now identified about 200 entities as being responsible for this extraction. None of those companies are blacklisted.
Yeah.
Not a single one, because the SIU investigation is still ongoing. So that's why we see them moving into other areas, and there's no impediment to them. They're not blacklisted. The chances of someone in Limpopo having the wherewithal to check if these companies are somehow on Babita's list is non-existent. So they will continue to make money. Case in point, the ANC Treasurer General in Ekurhuleni, Selo Sikoko. He had 3 companies doing trade with Tembisa Hospital. He's been raided by the Hawks, and he had a bit of a fallow period in his business. But last year, he was paid even more money to supply toilet paper to where? Tembisa Hospital. So it's just about biding your time if you've been sort of impugned by this scandal, because no one is going to check. There's no blacklist list to refer to. So you continue to make money just elsewhere.
Yeah, I saw a terrifying statistic that something like 674 companies nationally had been put on a list to be blacklisted. This is a decision that had already been made, and only one had been blacklisted. This is Treasury that not doing their work. So there's no database you can go on, to your point, to get that information. Jeff, we also recently spoke to Peter Louis Myburg, that was, offered a bribe by the CEO of the Independent Development Trust, and they managed to record that on film. He spoke to us about this sort of thin layer of investigative journalism, that there are only a handful of people doing it. What can the public do to assist the work that you're doing?
I think Peter Louis is absolutely right. There's a small crop of investigative journalists, and it's a small crop because of the contraction in the media space, which is obvious and we don't need to discuss. But the way to support investigative journalists is by funding us. Institutions like the Daily Maverick and Amabongania, you can contribute to them by donating funds and enabling them to do their work. At News 24, we have a paywall. And, the paywall is annoying for many people. But the only way we can fund these long-term and resource-heavy investigations is by asking people to pay for it. And I can say without a shadow of a doubt that this book would not exist, and our stories into Babita Deokaran would not exist if it were not for that paywall. I worked for months without producing a single word of copy that we could publish, because it's a research phase. And, people need to understand that good independent journalism comes at a price. And obviously, as a journalist, I want the most people to read my stories. I want the most impact. But if I'm not able to write those stories, then I get zero impact, and we can affect absolutely zero change. But I'm very lucky to work for a company that believes in and invests in investigative journalism. I think we have one of the largest teams in the country. We're incredibly well resourced because we have to be. Because this is difficult and long work that requires specific technology. In some cases, it requires protection when we step on the toes of dangerous people. And all of that comes at a fee. And so that's why it's important that journalism is supported, because I think Peter Lou is absolutely right. Oftentimes the ink of investigative journalists becomes the thin black line between total capture, you know?
Yeah. And one must remember there's a reason why that CEO of the IDT chose to try and bribe the journalist, not the policeman. The policeman's already sorted out. It's the journalist that has the independence to shine this light on this particular hole. I want to just delve into the impact of the book that you've written. The timing, obviously, to coincide with the Madlanga Commission and the Mkonazi revelations that brought that on. Do you feel that there's a political shift? Do you feel that, obviously it's not happily, but the government is being forced to do something about this now? Or is it too early to tell?
I think it's too early to tell. I think it remains to be seen, and we'll only be able to measure any sort of political shift or will behind a shift at the end of this thing. You know, the timing of the release of the book with the SIU's interim report, perhaps the book had a role to play in that, because whenever the anniversary of Babita's death rolled around, it's a milestone for press to say, well, the SIU, what are you doing? Gauteng Health, what are you doing? SARS, the Hawks, where are you? So, you know, it's always a pressure point for the arms of the state who've not yet concluded any of their investigations around this time of year. If anything, the greatest privilege that I've felt is being able to give the Deokaran family some answers. I set out to try and achieve justice for them. I don't think I've done that. If anything, I've given them information. And were it not for our involvement, I don't think Babita Deokaran would be the figure that she was today. I mean, the Hawks had ignored the forensic evidence. Her report had been covered up. And it was us who went and thrust that into the public domain. So I take heart in that. And I also take heart in the fact that there may not be justice for the profiteers in this scandal, but I'm secure in the knowledge that I've given them a pretty significant headache to deal with now.
Are there any other names? I mean, there was the name of Nomondo Nolotunga, who tried.
Yeah.
Explain what happened there.
So Dr. Nomonde Nolotunga was an HOD for a very brief period. She came in after Bandile Masuku's PPE scandal that rinsed out the sitting HOD then. And I mean, as Babita correctly put it, it's the Gauteng Health Department is a den of iniquity, and she saw that firsthand. And I think she lasted just less than a year. She herself was threatened when she tried to act against the hospital manager and the CFO, who Babita had implicated in her report. And I think that's really just a testament to the fact that there are good people who are trying to operate in a broken system. And it transcends the health department. It's the police and the NPA. You know, these are people who are set at a disadvantage from the start, yet who still risk their own lives and will give of their time and their own resources to do the right thing. Babita is an example of that. Dr. Nolotunga is an example of that. And Captain Freddie Hicks is an example of that. And even the prosecutor in this matter. You know, he was dealing with a real lemon of a case. And what we have to remember is everyone likes to take a swing at the NPA, and they must take their licks where it's necessary. But the reality is they must deal with what is given to them by the Hawks. If they get given a complete non-starter, they can't turn that around. And that's what we see far too often.
Jeff, dealing with the NPA, we had this weird spectacle of Shamila Batoy saying that at a recent conference that the bar for investigative journalism is way lower than the bar that they have to cross in order to get successful prosecutions. Do you see that in the work you've done here? Do you see that your work could never stand up in a court of law?
I think fundamentally she's right. And we go about different ways of evidence gathering, and their evidence is tested to a high degree. But in some instances, no. You know, some of the documents that I've uncovered and that helped produce this book can easily be turned into evidence and should spawn fraud charges. You know, we have the documents, we've published them, they exist in the public domain. And then it makes you wonder, why are these people not acting? and what's going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. So I think law enforcement, specifically the Hawks, need to take their licks on this one. The reality is that they failed the Deokaran family, and they continue to fail them even to this day, because we've tried to question them and sort of get insight into what they're doing, and the popular refrain we're met with is, this is an open investigation and we can't talk about that. But what that refrain does is becomes a shield to accountability, because now no one can interrogate exactly who took the wrong step where, or who fucked up where. It's all this whitewash, and we never get to see the outcome. And I think one of the most galling things about how this investigation was botched is that the investigating officer was promoted afterwards. And that to me is just physically galling.
Yeah, and with the benefit of hindsight, the investigation being botched, does it start looking like it was done on purpose, the botching?
Well, it's a pretty obvious conclusion to go to. I mean, I have no evidence that the investigating officer was paid off, but you have two scenarios. Only one can be true. You are either inept to the point of just being staggering that you've existed as a human being for this long, or you're acting on someone else's agenda, and it's got to be one of the two.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, one way that you can support the work that Jeff and others like him do is buy the book. And I can promise you, you're not just doing this to support Jeff Wicks. You're doing this because this is a necessary read. It was a book that came around at the right time. It's well written. It's well documented. And that's why it's getting the kind of attention that it is getting. Jeff Wicks, thank you so much for the work you're doing, and thank you for coming in on this to the State of the Nation. To everybody that joined us today, subscribe to the channel. We'll keep the good stuff coming. Jeff, thank you for joining us here on the State of the Nation this morning.
No, thank you, Mike.
Thanks.